host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. This is like episode 222. 222. Been doing this for 2 years. 1 year with Pascal Robert. A little over a year, actually. We didn't even bother to celebrate our year. We kind of had a loose plan to do like a year in review and look back on some things. We usually had a plan, and I think I mentioned this in one of the intros, that originally the plan was to play some of the older episodes that we kind of wished would have got more views. One that I really liked, and Pascal agreed, was we did an episode with a filmmaker, a guy named Billy Mintz. He made a documentary. This is documentarian, and he made a movie called The Guardians, which is about guardianship. And actually, that movie ended up getting turned into a Netflix film. And if you watch the episode, Billy will talk a little bit about that. He definitely gets a little more in depth in the patron-only after hours. That's the good thing about being a patron and going back. And if you watch these episodes or listen to these episodes, and I've been making them available on my audio only now for about 3 months now. But when you go back and watch some of these episodes in the after hours, when people are really good and loosened up and feel very comfortable with you, a lot of stuff flies out. And we had a fun time talking to Billy. I watched the movie The Guardians, and the documentary really hit me really hard. And the movie, oh God, I can't remember what the Netflix movie was called. Like I Care a Lot, or We Care a Lot, or I'm saying it wrong. I don't remember what it was called. But it definitely missed the point on the insidiously hideous nature of guardianship, and Billy's documentary took place mainly in Nevada. But that's not the show we're talking about today. We actually, there's an episode probably a few weeks back, if you remember, our guest did not show, Dr. Jack Rasmus. Not because he was giving us the middle finger, there was just a bit of a miscommunication. These things happen, especially in an era where people don't, have to physically drive to a studio and all that other stuff. Early on, when I did the show before the lockdown, I got to do it in studio. That was a lot of fun. Really miss those days. I look forward to that. But anyway, Dr. Jack hit us back, actually later that evening. And we were able to reschedule, and it's one of these pre-records that we have. So, hope you enjoy the show. We're excited to get Dr. Jack on. I like Dr. Jack. I look forward to seeing him when I return to the Bay Area. Here in Mexico, I saw my first scorpion. And it was hanging out on my terrace. And literally right before I sat down to do this, power's been out for quite a few days. So another good thing we got these pre-records done. We had some storms in Southern California that had definitely affected us here in Baja. And I went out to enjoy this beautiful morning, or afternoon rather now. The power just came back on. The internet was slowly waking up as well. And a big-ass scorpion was hanging out on the deck. And then it decided to climb up on the ceiling. And I've never had to encounter a scorpion before, so I did what any sane individual would do. I called my neighbor for backup. We ended up getting it. And after we very comedically got the scorpion down, we realized that the landlord's camera is kind of facing the deck, so she probably saw that whole thing, and she's probably still laughing right now because it was two grown men that were terrified of a poisonous insect. I hope she never releases that footage because it is rather embarrassing. But that's not what we talk about with Dr. Jack. We talk about what's going on with this Build Back Better infrastructure bill. We talk about the bipartisan bill. We talk about what was left out, why it was left out. We talk about inflation. We talk about supply chains. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Jack is an economist, has been, for what we say where I'm from, hella long. One of our favorite people to talk to. Wherever you're listening to the show, there should be links in the description to Dr. Jack's articles in Counterpunch and his website. He also has a radio show on Counterpunch. Should be a link in the description of that. The Anglo-pessimism shirts, we still have some for your holiday needs. As well as more This is Revolution merchandise. www.thisisrevolutionpodcast.com for all of your revolutionary wear. And I am out. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles, and if you haven't done it already, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to click that bell so you are notified every time we go live, because as the show is growing, which it is growing a lot, we are adding days, we are adding shows constantly. And I'm very excited about what we're going to be doing with the show, as far as we'll be having the new Diet Soap Media Critical Cuts airing on this. So if you remember Critical Cuts from when Doug Lane was running Zero,
video essays as well. And still be fighting Wi-Fi here in Mexico. So without further ado, let me bring in my homie, my co-host, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert, the man of the Mau Mau Hour. Give it up.
Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. There is no chat.
And also joining us today, while he is taking a break from double baby duty, Missouri's favorite professor, the whole state, Mean Gene Bajlan.
Greetings, Jason. Greetings, Pascal. It's great to see you guys today.
I did not even know Gene was going to be here. This is just a shock-a-roller for me.
I mean, at least you know who he is. It's not like it's your arch nemesis.
No, I don't have one on this show.
That's good.
Not yet.
That's good. We're nemesis free. This is nemesis free programming. Now, we had a mix up the other week, and we thought we were going to have Dr. Jack on, and we missed him, but we have him now. So I'm very excited for this show. If you guys are unfamiliar with Dr. Jack Rasmus, he is a former journalist. Dr. Jack Rasmus has served as an economist and analyst for several global companies and has roots in the labor movement. He was also a local union president, business representative, contract negotiator, and organizer for several labor unions. Please welcome, coming all the way live from the great state, California, from the Bay Area, the Dr. Jack Rasmus. Dr. Jack, welcome. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine, thanks.
Oh, perfect. So it's the economy, stupid, was the Bill Clinton thing they put on the wall to remind them what was important in the 92 presidential campaign to defeat, or was it 96? George Bush Senior. There were two bills, the reconciliation bill and now the Build Back Better bill. And many feel that Build Back Better will not pass Congress. Can you give us a quick background on what these two quote unquote stimulus bills are?
Yeah, well, they both have their origin back in March when Biden passed his first emergency fiscal spending bill called the American Rescue Plan or COVID Relief Bill or whatever. That was the $1.9 trillion of emergency spending, unemployment benefits, bailing out small businesses, giving some checks to folks, and a host of other measures. About $1 trillion of it was supposed to be spent this year. And the rest stretched out over the rest of the year. At least that's what was authorized. So you got to distinguish between when these bills are passed, the amount authorized to be spent and the amount actually spent, which is always less than what's authorized because of a host of rules that the Senate and Congress has. Anyway, that was the first bill. That was a what I call a mitigation bill. In other words, money was thrown out real quick because it looked like in the first quarter we were really falling into a double-dip recession with serious dimensions at the time. And that was designed to buy time. In other words, it wasn't really a stimulus. The stimulus would really mean it boosted the economy longer-term recovery. That was to fill the black hole of loss of income because of loss of jobs and collapsing small businesses and so forth. It was always supposed to be followed on with a real stimulus bill. And that was proposed at the same time last March. If you remember, that's what the progressives had put forward as, I think it was like $4 or $5 trillion.
And it was going to cut child poverty in half, right?
Yeah. That was what's left of that is called the Build Back Better bill. That included infrastructure spending, by the way. But what happened in March, after they got the 1.9 million rescue plan out of the way, was that the Democrat leadership, corporate leadership, got together with the progressive Sanders and Pelosi. She's a progressive. And not really, but they got together and they decided, well, we're going to strip out the infrastructure, the traditional infrastructure spending. We're going to strip that out and put that in a separate infrastructure bill. And what was left was roughly $3.5 trillion, which became known now as the Build Back Better bill for all purposes, right? Sometimes called the reconciliation bill. Those two terms are the same.
Gotcha.
So throughout the rest of the summer, the Democrats dilly-dallied, and Mitch McConnell said no, 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 his favorite word, and none of the Republicans came on board. And as of July of this year, those two bills were still pending. The infrastructure bill, which was now worth about $2.2 trillion of traditional infrastructure spending, and the Build Back Better bill, which was $3.5 trillion. That was in July. And the position of the progressives has always been in the House that you got to pass these two bills together. Because by splitting out the traditional infrastructure that had some support among the Republicans and all the corporate Democrats, right? If you pass that first, then you'd have no leverage to pass the social spending, the child care, the elderly care, the free college tuition, the preschool bill, all the other social spending that's in the Build Back Better. So those two were always linked. And Pelosi had agreed to placate the progressives in the House, the caucus, that, okay, we will vote them both up at the same time. But Joe Manchin gets into the mix, and Kristen Sinema, and they keep saying no, 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 not proposing anything alternative, but simply they just want to slow it down and they want to cut it down. And that goes on for a couple of months and through July, through August. By September, the pressure grows to in the corporate wing of the Democrats, which really run the Democrat Party, you got to remember. And you got to remember that Manchin and Sinema are part of the corporate wing, and they're running interference for the corporate wing. It's not just those two people in the Senate. It's real interests behind them, the corporate leadership in the Democratic Party, who's getting pushed by a lot of corporate lobbying, right? To go ahead with the infrastructure bill, because that means spending for businesses, right? But don't go ahead with the Build Back Better bill, because that's social programs. And most importantly, the Build Back Better bill, and to some extent infrastructure bill, to really pass them, it would require significant rollbacks of the Trump 2017 tax cuts, which amounted to $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, almost all going to investors and corporations and the wealthy over 10 years. $4.5 trillion. They kept telling us it's 1.5, but that's BS. It was $4.5 trillion, almost half of which just went to U.S. multinational corporations and cutting their taxes offshore from 35% to 10.5%. So big, the Trump tax cut was a big deal for $4 trillion plus for wealthy and corporations. And the whole idea and the promise of the Democrats and Biden during the election was that, we're going to claw some of that back.
Yeah.
And we're going to use that to pay for
this big plan.
Bills. So, that's what the fight really is about. The whole idea of the corporate wing led by Manchin and Sinema is to drive down the magnitude of the spending for the infrastructure bill, as well as especially the Build Back Better bill, so that they don't have to raise those taxes. They don't have to roll back the corporate and investor taxes. To borrow a phrase you said in the beginning, is the economy stupid? To really understand what's going on in these bills, it's the tax cuts, stupid. That's what this is. It's the tax cuts.
So you're saying that it's the Trump tax cuts that, from a bipartisan level, are trying to be protected.
Yes, exactly. And look what happened to the infrastructure bill that they favor. That's been passed now by both. We'll get to that. It was 2.2 trillion. They drove it down to 1.1 trillion. Manchin did, right? But even that is not accurate, because the new spending on infrastructure in that bill is only 550 billion. What they did was do smoke and mirrors and roll in already authorized transport and highway spending bills and added it to it to make it look like it's bigger, 1.1 trillion. But really, they broke it down from 2.2 trillion to 550 billion, and there's no real raising or reversing of the Trump tax cuts to pay for that. A lot of it is smoke and mirrors, moving the money around and so forth. And that's what they wanted. And that's how they got the infrastructure bill down to only 550 billion new spending over 10 years. Now they've been doing the same thing, rolling back the Build Back Better spending because the corporate interests don't want to raise taxes to spend to pay for that either. But what they've done here in the last month was to split out those two bills. Pelosi reneged on her position of having both bills voted at the same time. And a couple of weeks ago, if you remember, Biden came out with his own version, and then he brings in, to the White House, he brings in Manchin and Sinema and all those people, and they work out a deal. And then the next day, Pelosi reneges on voting up both at the same time and holds the vote on just the infrastructure bill to get that out of the way and eliminate all the leverage that the progressives might have in order to pass the Build Back Better bill. So she reneges on it and pretty much blows up the Progressive Caucus in the House, which loses all of its influence pretty much. And they're just begging now. They're not even negotiating because they don't have any levers to negotiate.
Well, let me ask you this. When you say they don't have any levers to negotiate, there's a lot of talk in the online world, more so about. Actually, can you turn your volume down on your side a little bit, Dr. Jack, because it's coming through? It'll be an echo.
How's that?
That's better. Now I can't. Well, yeah, I can't hear myself anymore. That's good. So there's a lot of talk about progressives not doing enough, and progressives need to do A, B, C, and D. And why don't progressives do A, B, C, and D? And what you're saying is progressives just don't have any power to make any real moves.
No, I'm saying that they had some and they capitulated, is what I'm saying.
They did have some power.
Oh, yeah, they could have blocked it. What they did was the last couple of weeks before they split them out and voted up the infrastructure bill by itself was Pelosi was busy looking for Republican support in the House, which they got enough. And when she knew she had enough, I'm sure she signaled Biden, and then Biden says, okay, I want this vote to split, right? And most of the Progressive Caucus votes with Pelosi to split it out. I think only about 6 or 8 of them, the Squad and a few others, actually stood by their progressive principles and voted no on the infrastructure bill, that 1.1 trillion, really 550 billion, right? A traditional infrastructure. They split that out, right? So it's a lot of political maneuvers being done over there. And the progressives got sucked in again, as they've been sucked in for, years now. Sanders running, and they're playing games and knock him out of the box twice. And then they go for the platform before the election of the Democratic Party, and the corporate wing does another trip on the progressives with Sanders. He keeps losing all the time. And, of course, the Progressive Caucus in the House lost here. They capitulated. The sop that Pelosi threw to them was that, look, we're going to go ahead and pass what you want, the 1.75 trillion Build Back Better, even though we split out the votes, right? And infrastructure is a done deal now. So I'll pass it. We'll pass it in the House, which is what the House has done. But knowing full well that once this thing gets thrown over the transom to the Senate, which it has been, that there's no leverage. There's no leverage for it, you see. So it's kind of a political fakery going on here. But it has passed. It has passed the House.
Would you say this is kind of inevitable? Whether, whatever the motivations of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party are, whether they're running interference or genuinely they would like to pass something bigger, they're kind of in a very weak position anyway, because when it comes to these votes, their choice is to obstruct completely, in which case very needed spending is not spent. That hurts, poor people, or they sign on to it, and then they get something which is wholly inadequate, but is at least crumbs from the table. Very much the kind of situation that happened with Obamacare, where Obamacare, in the short term, there was some very positive aspects, such as the Medicaid expansion and things like that, very important things for desperate people in the United States. But in the long term, the creation of Obamacare has perhaps stymied any future shift towards universal insurance or even a nationalized healthcare. So they're kind of stuck in this, they're in a lose-lose situation. Would you say that would be a fair assessment, or am I perhaps reading too much into it?
No, you're pretty close to it. I would add not just Obamacare, but the Bank Regulation Act. Same thing happened with that, right? The two hallmarks of the Obama regime, you might say, are really just so minimalist and easily outmaneuvered and picked apart after they were passed.
Are you talking about Dodd-Frank? You're talking about Dodd-Frank?
Yeah, Dodd-Frank. Well, yes, you're right. The progressives are so weak within the Democratic Party, you see. The Democratic Party corporate wing likes to keep them attached to the Democratic Party because that, keeps all the voters and supporters they have attached as well. And they pull through their votes during elections, but after elections, then they don't need them anymore. Yes, it's too weak. It's not big enough. And it won't be, I don't think, ever. I think the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, which is really the Democratic Leadership Conference faction that took over that party when Bill Clinton came in, they are the leadership now. They run that party. All the main candidates are their candidates. And they're not about to lose control of it to progressives or any other faction. Like the Republicans lost control to the Tea Party and the right wing. They see that, and boy, they're not going to let that happen. That's why they wouldn't let Sanders even come close to winning the nomination. They wanted him in the mix, and they promised him, he'd be in control of determining the budget and all that. Well, you can put up whatever you want, but doesn't mean it's going to get passed, see? So, yeah, I would pretty much agree with your assessment there.
Dr. Rasmus, question. Do you actually believe that the Biden administration is trying to pivot out of neoliberalism to an actual Keynesian model, or at least some would argue that they're thinking about going to social democracy? I'm not exactly, sanguine about that possibility. But do you think that these stimulus packages, whether it be the Build Back Better plan or whether it be the infrastructure bill, demonstrate a belief by at least the liberal faction of the ruling class and the political establishment that the traditional kind of neoliberal, hyper-privatized nature of capitalism that we've had for at least over 40 years plus has run its course?
I believe it's very much in the neoliberal tradition, and here's why. I wrote a book in January 2020 called The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump. And to understand neoliberalism, you got to understand there's four policy regimes under neoliberalism, right? There's fiscal policy, there's trade policy, there's monetary policy, and there's industrial policy. And the essence of those policies are, one, fiscal policy, you cut corporate and investor taxes. You may reverse that trend a little now and then to buy some votes, right? But that's what you do. You keep defense spending growing. You put a lid as much as you can on social spending, right? That's that side of it. The taxes, you cut taxes, particularly for investors and corporations and the wealthy. That's the fiscal side of that program. Now, you also, on the monetary side, you want to keep low interest rates and a lot of Federal Reserve Central Bank money injection, because low interest rates keeps the dollar low, and it allows U.S. multinational corporations offshore to repatriate their offshore profits at the max that they can. If the dollar was rising and rates were rising, they would be able to convert to fewer dollars. So trade policy, you want to keep running a trade deficit and recycling the money back to the U.S., have countries around the rest of the world buy treasury bonds, right? Keep that money running back so you could run a budget deficit here and pay for it that way, which means you don't have to raise taxes on the corporations, you see. Industrial policy, keep wage compression going, keep the unions weak, privatize where you can, deregulate wherever you can. Okay, so trade policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and industrial policy. Those are the four elements, and I described them in their evolution since 1979 up to 2019, 40 years. If you look at Biden, not much has really changed, has it, when you think about it, right? In emergency situations, neoliberalism will always throw some money at the public in terms of some spending, a little more unemployment benefits and so forth to keep the thing contained. But soon as the crisis is over, they turn towards austerity to take it back. Well, that's exactly what Obama did. You know, he comes out with a $787 billion rescue plan in 2009. And then in 2011, he agrees with the Republicans to take back $1.5 trillion in social spending. So they give with the one hand temporarily, and then they take it back, you know, when the crisis is over. And we can expect that, I believe, on the fiscal side as well from Biden here. Look at the tax policy. Yeah, he talked about raising taxes, but they haven't raised any taxes to pay for any of these fiscal bills, right? So that's very neoliberal. You know, don't take that big tax cut away from anybody, from corporations and from the rich. So fiscal policy in Biden is very neoliberal. What about monetary policy? Well, monetary policy, they've kept interest rates low. They've allowed the Federal Reserve to pump in $5 trillion in the last 18 months into the banks and investors, bail them out when they didn't even need bailing out. It wasn't even like 2008 and 9 where they bailed out the banks $4 trillion, right? Here they give them $5 trillion and they didn't even need to be bailed out. It's just subsidization of the banking system going on here by the Federal Reserve. So that
this is just to prop up the economy. So
no, it's you see, fiscal and monetary policy is no longer, in my opinion, about balancing and stabilizing the economy. It's about subsidizing the rich and their corporations. It's a big subsidization conduit, both the tax cuts on the fiscal side and the cheap free money on the monetary side. Look at what's going on in trade, right? Well, you know, Trump upset the trade relations a little bit, but
the tariffs.
Yeah, the tariffs and everything. Well, Biden is rolling back the tariffs. He's going back to the neoliberal consensus on tariffs, right? Mm-hmm. Look what's happening on the industrial side, right? Did he pass the minimum wage? He could have done it by, executive action as soon as he came into office. But what did he do? In February, the first group he met with were corporate CEOs, and the next day he says, "No, we're not going to raise the minimum wage to $15." That's very much.
That seems like an interesting. So you talk about, and I want to pivot to this because you actually talk about in your article and in your most recent podcast, and wherever you guys are listening or watching this, there are links in the description to Dr. Jack's podcast and his writing. You talk about the human infrastructure aspect to the Build Back Better bill that was actually removed. The universal pre-K, it was like a child care provision. Is this part of the neoliberal ideology to remove this human infrastructure aspect of these bills that are supposed to be
Yeah, yes and no. Yes and no. To some extent, all that was promised to the progressives during the election, you see, to keep them, they needed all the votes they can get, with all the gerrymandering and voter suppression going on in the red states. The Democrats knew the votes they could get, and they, kept the progressive wing tied to the party to deliver those votes. So in a sense, once they promised them, they had to put them on the table here. Once he was in office, right? But they've been taking him off the table piecemeal, one by one here, ever since. But to another extent, the capitalists know that the way the labor markets have changed, and if they want to keep women in the labor force, for example, they're going to have to do something about subsidizing childcare. They know that, or they're going to have problems like they're having now. One of the big problems with people back to work is a lot of women aren't coming back to work, right, because of unaffordability or lack of childcare. So the system needs to provide some new social programs to keep the lid on the discontent, and just even to keep the system functioning in terms of available cheap labor. So when I say yes and no, I mean, there's both of those elements contending. False promises they knew they were going to remove, and on the other hand, things they know they're going to have to do going forward. At least one wing of the capitalists know that. That's the Democrat wing.
That was actually, I had a follow-up about that. Childcare is actually a perfect example of what you're talking about, and more generally, some of this infrastructure. From the capitalist perspective, these things are actually required for the functioning of capitalism. Childcare, subsidized by the state, would be a boon to many business. Educate, it would be a huge boon for many of them, because you could have people going to work. And in our current crisis, there's a lot of talk about labor shortages, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously, you mentioned the issue of women not being able to return back to work. But a couple of months ago, we were told that the labor shortages were because the unemployment was so generous. Well, they cut the unemployment. There are still labor shortages. This seems like a very
they're fining people. Gene, I think you should add to that. People are getting fined in California. Dr. Jack could probably elaborate on this. They're going after, I forget how many people it was. I want to say it was over 1 million people they're going after, that if you received benefits, now you have to prove that you were unemployed.
It's great. So what explains this? What explains this labor shortage, given our current situation? And perhaps like a kind of add-on question to that is, from what you've explained, the Biden policy is not too dissimilar from the Obama policy that was adopted after 2008. But it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, the nature of the crisis that afflicted the American economy in 2008 is different from the type of crisis we face today. That was a man-made, like a cyclical financial crisis, whereas the crisis we're facing today is one that is like linked to this global pandemic and the fundamental disruption of supply chains and all these things. So I kind of a small picture and a big picture question to add in there.
Right. My analysis of the COVID recession, whatever you want to call it, that we're in, and I have a book in progress called The Viral Economy, is that the economy was significantly slowing down before COVID hit. Despite massive tax cuts and spending, it was slowing down both business investment and consumption here at the end of 2019, and that the COVID event precipitated and accelerated the collapse. But it was slowing down, going in that direction of just stagnating already. And the scope and magnitude of the collapse has been such that it has really restructured labor markets and product markets and even financial markets in ways that most mainstream economists don't know how to explain. And the government statistics have not really picked it up either. But we have some fundamental changes that are going to continue well into the future here. So my view is that this may even be another great recession 2.0. Remains to be seen. What's missing so far is the financial collapse. 2008-9, the financial collapse precipitated and dragged down the real economy and threatened to feed back again on the financial system, but they bailed it out. What you got now is the reverse. You got the real economy collapsing for a year or so and raising the potential that we may have a financial instability event down the road. Probably not right away because the central banks have thrown so many trillions at them to prop them up, pre-bail them out before anything like that happened. But we're beginning to see globally some real financial cracks in the system, both in China with the property developers, with dollarized bonds in Latin America and other places, banks here and there. It's not at crisis stage yet, but I wouldn't write off the fact that we may have, in the months ahead at some point, a financial instability event and inverted Great Recession 2.0. But that's my picture of, the big picture that you said. As far as the labor shortages are concerned, it's partly explained by what I said, because the labor markets have been upended. You see, they've been permanently, in some ways, really restructured in what's going on. I don't believe, first of all, there is as great a labor shortage as they're saying. If you look at the job statistics out today, what do you see? Well, 6.9 million people officially, formally unemployed. 4.5 million people part-time, involuntary part-time unemployed. In other words, they would love to have a full-time job. And then you got like 5.9 million more people who are out of the labor force altogether, but want a job, So to me, that says unemployment is somewhere still around 15 million or more. That doesn't describe a labor market shortage or supply problem, although in particular industries there is. You see, different sectors of the economy, there is a labor shortage. But in general, I don't think there really is a labor shortage. There's a mismatch between jobs that are being offered at low pay, right? Lousy jobs with no stability to them, few benefits, and no hope of any career or advancement. A lot of those jobs out there, right? Or there's jobs that require a lot of high technical skill that can't be filled because we've allowed the education system to fail. There's that kind of a picture for jobs. But there's also a lot of workers, who are just saying, look, I'm not going back to flipping those buggers anymore. There's nothing to that. I'm tired of working 2 or 3 jobs, gig work and whatever, and they're taking the opportunity now. They know there's a declared shortage, and in some places in the economy, employers are having to raise wages to get people back, and they're exploring those opportunities. I wrote an article in September called The Great Strike of 2021. And it's really the strike of the unorganized, although we see a lot of union activity here with John Deere and others at the same time, strike activity. But strike simply means you withhold your labor from work. That's the definition of a strike. And you don't have to be in a union to strike. You just withhold your labor. So we got a great strike going on, and we got employers in the weakest positions raising wages in response to it. So I think there's a lot of workers who are just holding back, looking around, trying to get something better. Then, of course, we have the problem of a lot of single women or women in the labor force can't find childcare or go back, affordable childcare. There's a mismatch there. And there's other explanations of it as well. It's not unemployment benefits, because that was pretty clear that when the Republicans cut off unemployment benefits in June in some of those states, they didn't get people back to work. In fact, more people went back to work in states where they kept the unemployment benefits. And then when they all ran out in September, unemployment benefits under the special programs ran out, you still didn't get people back to work. So it's not the unemployment that's doing it. I think there's a big rethinking going on in a lot of sectors of the working class as to, I just can't keep up with this kind of arrangement. I got to find something better. And that's what's going on, I think.
Do you think it also might be part of the fact that many workers who are dealing with the COVID reality are afraid to risk their lives? They're basically saying that there's certain jobs they don't want to go back to because of the potentiality they may be increasing their chances of being exposed to COVID.
Absolutely, that's part of it too. I didn't mention that, but not just for themselves, but maybe they're taking care of elder people in their household, right? Or they got a lot of children, or like some groups like Latino families. These are extended families. They all live together, and they're not in mansions with a lot of room, and they got to think about, not just themselves, but what am I going to do to the rest of my family if I go out there and catch it?
Well, that was an issue. There were actually a few stories coming out, especially in the Bay Area. There was an article early in the beginning stages of COVID last year during the lockdown. I think San Francisco Gate did the story about a community that was around the Mission area, which is a large Latin population. I want to say the Latin population had like a 90% COVID rate, and it was multi-generational families living together. People had to work either the service industry or like the gig economy that were constantly exposing themselves. And I don't know if people really remember those early days of COVID. Uber and DoorDash and all these companies really weren't helping you out with any kind of personal protective equipment. From masks to gloves to even hand sanitizer. So we literally, as a nation, kind of sacrificed these people for the greater good of the economy, so to speak.
Yeah, that not just the gig and those kind of service jobs, but even in mass production, which really did shut down this country, meat processing and so forth, very high COVID rate and death rate in some of those meat packing plants and other places as well. They don't report that too much, they don't want to say too much about that. The ethnic concentration of the infections because of working conditions and housing conditions, because if you point that out, the next question is, well, why is it, and then it comes down to working conditions and housing conditions, and then you got to do something about that they don't want to do. So the mainstream media kind of, just touches the fringe of this problem.
Dr. Rasmus, I want to ask you a question that's really kind of at the crux of much of the discourse around the current economy. What exactly is the cause of the current inflation crisis, if you believe there is an inflation crisis? And why is it being politicized in the way it is, both on the right and on the left, with on the right making it seem like it's all Biden's fault and that this is a demonstration of the Democrats' inability to marshal control of the economy, and some elements on the left acting like, oh, it's not that bad, it's actually being overly overblown, it's not really a factor at all? What exactly is your position on the inflation question, and could it potentially lead to a rise of interest rates?
Yeah, well, my position is that inflation is worse than the reporting. The CPI, Consumer Price Index, what is it, 6%, 6.2, 6.3, something like that. I think it's well over 10%, the consumer price, because the CPI is based on all income groups, you see, the cost of living of all income groups, and it has certain weights to the different kinds of spending, like lodging gets a heavier weight, food gets a heavier weight, transportation costs, and so forth. And those weights are based on the entire economy and all the income groups. But if you go to the median and below the median income groups, then the weights should be higher for food, for gasoline, for lodging, but they're not. So I think it's really hitting, the middle class, the true median middle class and below, a lot harder. And there's some things about the price index that I think are kind of phony. For example, they report rent costs at less than double digit, but people aren't aware that in doing that, they take the actual rent increases of about 50 million rental units in this country, and then they take 50 million homeowners and say, well, the homeowners pay themselves rent, which is oxymoron nonsense. And that's only 2% per year, you see. So that's a total phony figure. But when you average that 2% for 50 million into the actual increase for true renters, 50 million, you get a much lower number. And games like that are played in the Consumer Price Index and the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so forth. They assume, another example is your cell phone can do so much more, but instead of costing $900 for the Apple 13, it's really only $400 because of all these improvements in quality. You're paying $900 no matter what in the market, but they're factoring in only $400 for that particular item. So there's lots of those games being played, I think, with the Consumer Price Index, as they've always been. And so the inflation is much more. I think it's at least 10% here. So that's my position on that, which kind of says to the left, you can't ignore the reality. Come on, your average working person knows, what these prices are. They go to the grocery store and they can see it. Right.
Is this a function then of the disruption of the global supply chains? We have obviously COVID shutting down cheap imports from China and other parts of Asia. We had that ship block the Suez Canal. Would you say this inflation is like always the argument is inflation is a product of government spending, which obviously there's a truth to that, but the flip side is this disruption in supply chains and the fact that production was mothballed in many places prior to the during the pandemic. So is this a spending problem or is this a supply chain problem, and will this supply chain problem rectify itself over time?
And how much of COVID has to add on to that, what part of COVID has to do with this inflation / supply chain problem?
Well, the supply chain problem is a goods problem, not services, because we only import goods, you see, and not all goods are really imported. The goods that come from Asia, right, China and Asia, produced, by the way, largely by American corporations that moved there, right? Not all, but that means import prices rise, and that bleeds over into the Consumer Price Index. But that's for goods, see? And manufactured goods is only like 12% of the total economy. Another 8% for construction and 80% is services. And a lot of services are rising, which means it's not supply chain, right? It's something else. I'll get to that. So I don't agree with the left that says, oh, poo-poo, it's not a problem, right? It is a problem. It's partly a global supply chain problem. It's partly a domestic supply chain problem. It's not really a demand problem, in my view, for two reasons. One, first of all, you're going to have a pickup in demand when you had virtually no demand at all the year earlier, right? There's got to be an increase in demand as the economy opened this spring. And some people went back to work and people began spending more. So when you come off a base of last year of virtually no price increases, you're going to have some extra price increases due to the reopening demand. Now, as far as the Biden administration is concerned and their, quote, excess spending, that's a red herring. That's not the cause at all. Look, as I said earlier, how much of excess spending have we gotten from these fiscal bills? Think about it, right? You have the only thing that's hit the economy is this $1.9 trillion of the American Rescue Plan last March. Only $1 million of that was authorized to be spent here this year. We've only been 6 months, roughly, a little more than 6 months, since that bill was passed. So, maybe a $500 million, right, has been hit the economy in 2 quarters, a half a billion. Let's say, look at the third quarter here. Let's say 250 billion, half of that 500 billion hit the economy. 250 billion spending in the third quarter on a $5.5 trillion GDP is, as we used to say in the union, mice nuts. It's nothing. You know, you got 1 or 2% boost to GDP from $250 billion. That's nothing. And they say that's what's caused inflation. That's what Republicans are saying. That's what businesses are saying. Because I don't think it's so much a demand. There's a little bit of demand because of the reopening of the economy. There's a lot to do because of supply, both global supply chains that are broken down and domestic, because the big problem is they can't get truckers to move the stuff around once it hits the ports. So you got a domestic supply problem. But I believe a lot of the price increases, particularly in the services, are rising because businesses simply think they can do it. You know, is it supply? Is it demand? Or are prices rising because simply business thinks they can?
Mm-hmm.
The third factor.
Do you think
it's price gouging? It's price gouging. I think there's a lot of that going on because if you look at some of the items that are rising in price, right? It's not a problem supply doesn't come from abroad, right? It's not a problem of demand, right? Same thing we had before. I mean, look at the meat prices. We don't import the meat. We produce the meat here, and yet those prices are going through the roof. But workers have been working in those factories ever since. Mm-hmm. There's no change in supply. There's no change in demand. If anything, the demand for meat might have declined as people didn't have the income. But look at the prices for meat and eggs. The same thing for eggs. The same thing for milk, right? Are we importing milk from cows in Argentina? No, right? A lot of this inflation is price gouging. A lot of it is neither supply, neither demand. They're raising prices because they can.
What about the correlation to oil prices? Oil prices have been rather high, have been on the increase for the last few months. Do you think that could be part of the reason why the price of goods has gone, or services have been on the increase as well? Because usually there's a correlation between energy costs and inflation.
Yeah, there's a correlation, but not necessarily a causation, you see. Too much we assume correlations mean causations. Yes, crude oil prices have risen, no doubt about it. They're going down sharply now. We won't see the drop in the gasoline prices, even though they're going down about $15 a barrel here since last week. But yeah, there is some rise in crude oil prices. But, you know, most of the crude oil in the United States is produced in the United States. The U.S. is the biggest producer of crude oil in the world. It's bigger than Saudi Arabia or Russia. We produce more through fracking and what are we doing? We're exporting it. Yeah, why are we exporting oil? You know, when, quote, we got a shortage and prices are rising now. Well, because the oil companies want to do that. They make more money that way. And whenever you get a crude oil increase up the chain, you know, the next supply chain, the tankers, if it's coming from abroad, they absorb that price increase and they mark up their own on top of it, you see. Then it gets to the refineries and they do the same. They absorb that price increase and use it as an opportunity to mark up the price even more. Then it goes to the truckers. Then it goes to your local gas stations. And everybody along the chain does a markup, right? But when the demand declines, you know, they don't go down, or they don't go down very much, is a problem. Another problem with the global oil prices is, you know, supply and demand really doesn't change that dramatically in such a short time. What you got are global commodity oil futures speculators who are grabbing contracts, grabbing claims to this oil produced, you know, in OPEC or whatever, and they sit on it because they know the price is going to rise, and they don't release those contracts, and that's the supply, until they can flip it and make a profit. So there's a lot of speculation. You know, oil prices at the pump just don't go up, you know, the amount that they've gone up 20, 30, 40% sometimes, some places, as a result of the supply or even the demand for crude oil. There is a factor there, no doubt, but It's not. Again, it's a monopoly power that the oil companies have, and they raise prices because they can.
Do you think this is a consequence of the fact that as a result of COVID, there was such a loss of profitability? In order to recoup that loss, they basically decided to increase pricing or price gouging, as you say, to basically profiteer off the fact that there was a short period of time in which they were taking a loss?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the force behind a lot of it, behind the price gouging. A lot of these, particularly service companies, lost a lot of money last year, and as the economy reopened here this summer, they tested the market. How much can we raise our prices? Let's see how much and keep it going as long as it'll bear. You make profits. There's only three simple ways for a capitalist to make profits, right? You either sell more of your stuff, right? Or you raise the price, or you cut the costs. That's it. And what they are doing now, I believe, and have been doing, although now the bottom is weakening in that for them, is to test the market, raising prices as much as they can, whether or not they have a supply or demand issue.
So what would you say then the long-term prospects are for the American economy and more generally the global economy? There's been jitters about the real estate market in China. There is a huge currency collapse taking place in Turkey. These are all quite major economies that, obviously due to the interconnected nature of the global economic system, could knock over what seems to be a house of cards. So how do you see the United States faring in the, like medium term as sort of we progress through the Biden administration? Are any of these issues going to be resolved? Is inflation going to go down? How do you see this shaking out?
And also, can you add to that kind of a little bit of context for the Chinese, was it a real estate company? I can't think of the name of the company.
Evergrande.
There you go. And how that affects the American economy.
Yeah. Well, that's a flashpoint. We've been having these flashpoints rise and fall here for since the beginning. Financial flashpoints, I might say. We had this company called Greensill, this bank in Britain. We had Archegos, I think it's a hedge fund here, and now we got Evergrande over there our property developers over there in China that have been raising more and more debt. Evergrande has $300 billion in debt that it's used to expand its property developing in China. Now it's got to pay the principal and interest on that debt, and it doesn't have the cash flow to do it. So they're trying to raise money, but other capitalists don't want to throw money down a hole they think is going to get bigger, right? So what they're doing, the Chinese are doing, is forcing the owner and the capitalist who've made big profits off of Evergrande to put their own bucks back into the pot, to bail it out. That's what they're doing. They're squeezing the capitalists down there. Something we never do here when there's a financial crisis. We let them take their personal wealth and go away. But you got a big problem with the property development sector that's overbuilt in China and based upon debt and borrowing. And a lot of that borrowing is from Western capitalists, Western investors who want their money. They don't want it to default because then they won't get any money, you see. And it's not just Evergrande, it's Acacia and some of the others. It's the whole sector over there. So that if that really collapses, which I don't think it will, I think the Chinese are just going to make the capitalists pay and then bail it out. But if it did, it would be a source of contagion over to the Western finance capitalists who have pumped money into that sector. In other words, they would take the loss as well, and the contagion would then spread from them to other businesses. So you could have a chain effect. The problem is the global dollarized bond markets. You see, these companies have borrowed in dollars. Latin America has done a lot of that too, dollarized bonds, corporate bonds. And if the value of the dollar rises, then the value of those currencies in those countries, like the Turkish lira, falls. If the Turkish lira falls, then it's harder for them to make the payments on the principal and interest of the debt that they borrowed, you see. So it raises the threat of defaults in those countries as well. The lira is particularly weak. That's why it's a flashpoint right now. But typically Latin America currencies are in the same boat, and the South American rand and some of the others. The point is that we are seeing these financial flashpoints keep flashing, and the question would be, at what point would one really collapse and cause a global contagion effect across the others? The IMF is preparing for this, you see. The IMF has raised $600 billion to bail out these countries where that might happen. So they know something like this is coming, maybe. How close we are, it's hard to tell. It's not a crisis yet, but it could be. And if we have a global financial crisis, then it'll further feed back negatively and impact the real economy and depress it as well.
Pascal, is there a question?
So overall, what you're basically saying is that we might be on the precipice of a major kind of economic collapse. The question I wanted to ask you is that, in the face of the fact that Wall Street is doing well, and so much of that profitability, if you will, it's not even profit, it's caused by stock buybacks by shareholders of their own shares of corporations, which are keeping the numbers in terms of the Dow doing so well. Doesn't that really demonstrate that the notion that the financial services sector of the economy itself is doing well is also a bit of an illusion also, in that the whole economy is somewhat on a house of cards in that regard?
Yeah, I've argued for a long time that, and as I mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, has been subsidizing investors, and particularly financial asset markets. That's why stock markets and bond markets and foreign exchange and derivative markets have all been driving upward during this whole crisis, you see, because a lot of the money has been going there. It's not going into the real economy, or hasn't been, and causing these bubbles. And you can see the markets, stock markets hiccup every time it looks like the interest rates or tapering may occur, because they know this. They know the money has been flowing to them. Just to give a dimension to what you said in terms of stock buybacks, since Obama, 2011, stock buybacks and dividend payouts by the large corporations in this country, I'm not talking about the small ones, I'm just talking about Fortune 500, 2,000, whatever, have amounted to, over the last 10 years, over $10 trillion. $10 trillion has been distributed by corporations to their shareholders in the form of stock buybacks and dividend payouts. Under Obama, it rose from about $600-700 billion a year to almost $1 trillion. Under Trump, for 3 years, it was over $1 trillion, 1.2-1.3 trillion every year in buybacks and dividend payouts. And then this year, the projections are even higher. Record, maybe 1.4 trillion this year in buybacks and dividend payouts. I mean, there is a huge conduit of money flowing into shareholders and capitalists of all kinds that people aren't even aware of. And it seems to be built into the system now, and will continue because of the monetary policies and because of fiscal tax policies, allowing corporations to keep a lot more money, which they then throw into the hands of their shareholders. We're talking about $10-12 trillion in the last decade alone being redistributed to shareholders. I mean, it boggles your mind when you think about that. And then they'll argue over $10 or $20 billion in Congress whether you keep people from being evicted from their house. It just shows you what really matters.
Is the Fed going to be able to continue doing this with the current inflation crisis? Are they going to be forced to increase interest rates?
I believe they're going to raise interest rates because the inflation is going to continue here. for at least 6-12 more months. The supply side driven inflation is not going away because fundamentally the economy has changed, right? And the political pressures on the Fed are to raise interest rates. So I believe the Fed is going to raise those interest rates reluctantly and holding back as long as it can to do that, because when it raises the interest rates, push up the value of the dollar, depresses the value of other currencies around the world, and then we have those problems I talked about with dollarized bond payments and U.S. corporations repatriating their profits and so forth. That's why neoliberalism always tries to keep interest rates low. You see, that's the hallmark of its monetary policy. But yes, I think they are going to raise the interest rates here, but reluctantly and slowly. It's hard to predict. It depends on how the economy produces here in the first 6 months of next year, I think, and the global economy, and also whether they pass any of this stimulus bills, which I don't think they're going to pass. Build Back Better. If they do, it will be somewhere maybe around 500, 600, 700 billion, so they don't have to raise taxes to pay for it. You see, same thing they did with infrastructure. They didn't want to raise the taxes, so it'll be minimal and not enough to really stimulate the economy. And I think the combination of the lack of fiscal stimulus and the fact that rates will be raised, which will, slow down certain sectors of the economy, and the fact of inflation continuing, is all going to depress consumer spending, which is 2/3 of the economy after the first of the year. I think that's what we're going to see. It's going to be a classic Great Recession kind of trajectory of recovery. Great recessions, as I've written, are really, you have the crash, and then you have a series of short, shallow recoveries followed by short, shallow declines once again, and more short, shallow recovery. You bounce along the bottom, you see. And if this is a great recession, even though we haven't seen the financial crisis element yet, I think that's the kind of trajectory we're going to see: short, shallow, bouncing along the bottom kind of scenarios.
And the final question I want to ask you before we leave, we're coming up, we're a little over the hour right now, and I do want to ask you this. On your last podcast, you did say, and you've written about this too, I've read, you think Joe Manchin is going to throw his hat into the presidential ring. I find that quite interesting because he would be a very hard right turn for the Democratic Party as they are entering their age of wokeism.
Yeah.
Would this be the shift if the Democratic Party does suffer these big losses as certain pundits are predicting in 2022? Do you then think the retaliation to the woke losses would possibly be running a candidate like Joe Manchin?
Oh, I think the Democrats are toast in 2022. They haven't done much to stop the voter suppression, and they haven't done much anything to stop the gerrymandering. So that means, with the redistricting, with the census here, the Republicans are in a stronger position. And I think a lot of progressive Democrat voters out there are going to vote with their feet. They're not going to support the Democratic Party any longer here in the midterm elections. So yes, I think that's a done deal. As for Manchin, I don't know. I mean, the guy is really running like he's in the campaign here. He's doing all the things campaigners do. I think he's certainly going to run. He's going to throw his hat in the ring. Whether the corporate wing of the decision makers go along with it, I think it depends upon what the progressives do. If the progressives say, the hell with you, Democrats, then the Manchin will run. And you see some of the messages coming out of all the pundits, in the party. Saying, the party's gone too left, it's gone too left. We need someone more central, and he's quote, the centrist candidate, or will try to position himself as the centrist candidate. So I think he's definitely going to run. Whether he gets the nomination depends on a lot of other things, but it's just a reflection of what the Democratic Party really is about.
Wow. I mean, I guess my next quick question, and this is to the panel, who would be the progressive candidate that could run in 2024?
I think they would make sure that there isn't one.
Well, they'll give a fake progressive, right? Like, I don't think the Democratic Party, I don't like Joe Manchin can run, but even normie liberal centrist Democrats don't like him, not because he's like too centrist, just because he's kind of like, he's not a team player and, they're not happy. He just doesn't, he's not loved by mainstream liberals, right? They just don't like him. Like, and I'm not talking about Bernie Sanders people, like the Buttigieg, the Kamala Harris type of people.
The Elizabeth Warren crowd, yeah.
None of them are they're gonna try and do. Maybe Kamala was a misfire. I don't think she's going to be plausible. They will try Pete Buttigieg, and then trust me, Pete Buttigieg. All we'll hear when he's running is they're trying to ram Pete Buttigieg down our throat. That's going to be like the line that they use. But like the Democrats don't have a cadre of people to run anyway. Then because it's a gerontocracy, the Democratic Party. The Republicans have fresh blood. There was always some sociopath coming out of the Heritage Institute, groomed and ready to go. The Democratic Party, it's still run by boomers, right? It's like run by people who came of age in like the 1980s. And
even if it's not run by boomers, the people that they have are generally people who are pivoting on kind of identitarian notions of what should be a candidate. You get your Stacey Abrams types, you get those particular individuals who really offer no deviation from the traditional corporatist policy, but they basically offer the fact that they are Black, woman, gay, transgender, XYZ, so on and so forth. So that becomes the actual means by which they try to seem progressive. I think that perhaps the most progressive that they might try to trial balloon is maybe Elizabeth Warren. It'd be interesting to see if she tries to come back again in 2024 to act as if she's the most progressive candidate. But I don't see the Sanders faction coming up with a candidate between now and then.
I don't know if there's anyone old enough to run. Maybe Rashida Tlaib.
They could run Jayapal, but Jayapal was born in India. But like, they're not gonna. They just don't have anyone. Bernie was a one-off, right? He was like just some obscure socialist senator who came from another age and who ran a messaging campaign that came out of nowhere, right? It was like a perfect flash in the pan. You have a whole generation of millennials who think the whole neoliberal project is bullshit, ended up powering his candidacy. But at the end of the day, that wasn't enough to get him over the top. And there was, like the Sanders campaign created some kind of like new wave of progressive, but it's like pretty tiny, and there's going to be a pushback. They're going to run, like they're already planning to run someone against Cory Bush. The Cory Bush pissed off the line of succession in New Orleans politics. They're going to run someone against him. We discussed this before, but it didn't do. AOC didn't get that many votes when she knocked out when she got her seat. It was all it's like been very limited. So like there isn't an infrastructure for even a moderately progressive candidate. So it's going to be someone like Joe Manchin probably losing to somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, an identitarian candidate like Pascal says.
That's a very sad note we're ending on, and we're not supposed to end on sad notes. But I don't know if there's any silver lining. Is there a silver lining in any of this, Dr. Jack? Is there any hope anywhere? Is labor possibly our silver lining?
Yeah, well, there's some very interesting developments going on. The problem with labor is that the very head, the top level, is as tied to the Democratic Party as close as you could get. And as they've grown weaker, they've tied themselves to the party's apron strings even more. So nothing's going to happen on the top. But, if you look below the top, there's some interesting developments, not necessarily political. But interesting developments. The auto workers have got the right now to vote directly. The Teamsters got the right to vote directly. The top guys have controlled these unions by delegate voting at conventions where they turn their national reps loose to make sure that their locals that they serve deliver the delegate votes for whoever they want at the top. That's been holding back the labor movement. But now if you have direct elections for leaders from below, that mitigates against that top-down bureaucratic silo unionism that's been the death knell of the labor movement in this country. And then you see workers, now you got more and more millennials in the labor force, and they've been catching it on the chin now for decades. And the Zoomers behind them, they look around at the system and it doesn't look all that good to them, and they're the labor force of the future. And who knows what they're going to do? I don't think they're going to put up with the crap that's been going on for several decades under neoliberalism. But it remains to be seen how much they really break loose, because there's this huge bureaucratic apparatus that's sitting on the labor force. I wrote a song in one of my plays called "The Web" about all this legal strings holding back, whether it's legislation or NLRB or courts or whatever, holding back the right to strike and everything, just keeping labor down, keeping the workers down. It's a real science in this country, the way they've built this thing to hold everybody down and keep them all separated from each other and from their communities. But if the conditions get such, and I'm positive about the young workers. They got a long way to go, but from what I see, there are some signs of some awakening going on, and we'll see how far that goes.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, Dr. Jack, and giving us a rundown on what's going on with the state of the economy here in this country, and also kind of a rundown on what's going on globally. Wherever you're watching this show or listening to this show, there are links in the description to follow Dr. Jack, not just on Twitter, but his website, his podcast, and his latest book that's out. So, Dr. Jack, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Pascal and Jean, we are